Hello everyone, welcome to yet another episode of Azure On Air. And today I have a very special guest, Tarun Garg, Senior Azure Integration Consultant. And I'm really excited to learn a lot of tips from Tarun on one of his recent endeavors with integration using Logic Apps.
If you have BizTalk, why you need Logic App or what
Mm,
value Logic App brings when you already have BizTalk. Logic Apps is more like it's easy to start with them. These days, it's difficult to predict how much integration capacity you need for next 3 years. People overlook initially is
mm.
each and everything in Logic App has some capacity at the end of the day.
Tarun, welcome to our show, and I am eager to listen to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm,
And this is Tarun Garg. I have been working as an Azure integration consultant, primarily focused on Logic Apps
mhm.
and Azure functions.
Yes, Tarun. Tell us briefly about your current role and your experience in the domain that you are working with, Tarun.
Yeah. So currently, I work as an integration consultant, working, uh, delivering basically Logic Apps integration
Mm-hmm,
for Dynamics 365, finance and operations, to be very specific.
mm-hmm,
Most of my integrations involve one side Dynamics and other side is a range of products from third party or APIs calls or calls to FTP server and things like that. And overall, it's quite a challenging scenario because Dynamics work as a dumb system. So either you
mm-hmm,
need to push data to Dynamics or you need to pull out of it. Okay, so
mm-hmm,
that's little challenging,
mm-hmm,
and it's a good journey on Logic App side also, and
mm-hmm.
Logic Apps are quite reliable. So I've been really happy that previously I used to work on BizTalk, so it's a good transition for me from BizTalk to Logic App.
Awesome. So I could understand from your profile that you have more than decade of experience into this IT industry, and as you just mentioned, you have hands-on experience in BizTalk as well as in Logic Apps. Now I'm curious to understand how your Logic Apps has transformed the way you build your business applications.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and many people will try to understand that if you have BizTalk, why you need Logic App or what
Mm,
value Logic App brings when you already have BizTalk. I think BizTalk is sort of a use case which is relevant in on-premise systems a lot, even
mm-hmm,
today. There are many use cases where BizTalk will give you a lot of benefits.
mm,
Uh, Benefits with BizTalk is you have a predictable running cost. So you know how much messages you can process and you can do your costing for the year.
mm-hmm,
Logic Apps is more like it's easy to start with them. It's good
mm-hmm,
for cloud-based integrations, and its scale out, I would say, is very good. So one of the places where Logic App, since it's a serverless component, it's
mm-hmm.
can scale out easily, which is like a big challenge in BizTalk because you've developed an application, but you don't know whether it can support 1 million messages or not. But in Logic Apps, you can scale out easily and see that it can manage huge amount of load. Other thing which I've seen is Logic App, the coding, although BizTalk has less code, but Logic App has even less code. So
Mm-hmm.
even a person who is non-BizTalk, non-Logic App background, I think if it, in my experience only, I've seen a lot of D365 developers
Mm-hmm.
are able to transition from and look into Logic App. I think I want to mention one important point here. Like when it comes to Logic App, post deployment and production support, uh, the type of profile you need for Logic App support is very a standard profile. Who
Mm-hmm.
just understand coding either in Java, he can have a look, and with few days of training, he can be all trained to look into Logic App errors, whatever is happening, and
Mm-hmm.
point out where is the problem and then
Mm-hmm.
give it to relevant technical support team. But with BizTalk, it's a big challenge. It's a big learning curve before actually reaching that stage. So
Mm,
overall, it's a good
mm,
transition for cloud-based products. Logic App is quite good, and there is no parallel product for like Logic App even in Azure AWS. So a lot of
mm.
customers use Logic App a lot.
Awesome. So, as I understand from your explanation, so it's easy to scale up. So, the learning curve is not so deep and less coding, which means I can build applications faster and take the reliable application to production much sooner. And with
Yeah,
serverless benefits, it comes without saying scaling, seamless scaling. Awesome.
correct.
So, wonderful. So this are there any other advantages in logic apps in against BizTalk servers that are the classic way of building?
Yeah, so Logic App, other advantages, Bistock
Mm,
server is more XML based
mm-hmm,
and payloads are big size,
mm,
and Bistock server overall is XML based. So but Logic Apps are more as JSON based.
mm,
So that gives added advantage because JSON processing is natively supported in Logic App, which is not there in Bistock.
mm,
Similarly, since Logic Apps, you can start at a very small space, that gives an added advantage. Like if you have to set up a Bistock server for production, it's like a 3 months project to get the things end to end done, right from
mm,
the starting to the very end. But on the similar lines, if you have to set up something in Logic App, it could be a few days. You can make running one of your first uh, interface.
mm, mm, mm,
So that is one of the major advantage because time to market is very less, and it is one of the features which is used by my customers also, because
mm,
Dynamics itself is a big product to integrate, but it's not that on day one I know what will happen after 3 months or 6 months. So
mm,
we can start with initial integrations, which are basic integrations, and as and when requirement comes, I can scale out and bring more logic apps. I don't need to bother about what hardware I have purchased, how much
mm,
capacity I need for next 2 3 years, and I think that's a major advantage because these days it's difficult to predict how much integration capacity you need for next 3 years or something like that,
mm,
which is required for setting up a Bistock production box. I used to remember in my old days, we used to do all those prediction analysis and then come back,
mhm,
then
mm.
capacity we need, which is no more required.
Awesome. So, Logic apps are clearly with a rich set of connectors. It's very easy to get started, isn't it, Tarun? Do you have you found the connectors to be fitting into your business scenarios?
Yeah, most of the basic connectors are, so I'm not
Mm,
creating much custom connector. I
mm,
think what I've seen is there are a lot of connectors which are written on top of HTTP
mm,
connector. But instead of using like for Dynamics also, we have a rich set of Dynamics connectors.
mm,
But what I've seen is performance wise is better if you can use the HTTP connector
mm,
instead of using some connectors provided by third party or Microsoft, which are actually written over HTTP and
mm,
at times don't support your scenarios. So more or less, I try to use the basic HTTP connector most, and
mm,
then blob and file share.
mhm,
So within Azure resources, I think they are perfect connectors. I've not seen any problem. Only which you thing which you need to remember is which
mm,
which people overlook initially is
mm,
each and everything in Logic app has some capacity at the end of the day.
mm,
There is
mm,
a URL in Microsoft which defines what capacity or concurrent connections a particular connector supports till it hit throttling. So
mm,
also has throttling limits. So one has to remember those limits and accordingly plan it out. Like I think for emails, it could be like you can send 500 emails in parallel. So if you stuck your
mm,
system, suppose 1,000 emails, then definitely you will hit throttling. I've seen
mm,
throttling myself in Logic apps,
mm,
but that's a design parameter that Logic app has is limitless, but each
mm.
parameter has some limitations uh, which we have to look into.
We
And
need to
there,
consider while we build our application. Right.
And there are workarounds to manage those
Mm,
limitations, but you
mm,
should first know that there are limitations there.
exactly. So we need to build considering the limitations and accommodating them in our
Correct.
logic.
And that's where the design is
Yeah.
critical.
So
Someone who's do that design.
that's true. That's true, Tarun. So I'm going to ask you about some design tips as we proceed further. Meanwhile, I got a curious question actually. So are you actually dealing with an hybrid integration here? Do you have still a part of your application running in your on-premise, and is it connected to your Logic App workflow with a HTTP connector? Is this an even a valid scenario?
It's a valid scenario. In few cases, I have done those things,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not a very frequent scenario in my case. Most
Mm-hmm.
of the time, the on-premise systems are connected over file
Mm-hmm.
instead of Logic App because they cannot support the serverless load. So even
Mm,
serverless setup and you can connect, its file share is more reliable than over HTTP just because of load. Because serverless you can load thousands of messages, but your on-premise cannot manage that much load. So in
exactly.
end to end, we try to use a sort of a disconnected mode just to prevent on-premise servers from timeouts and all those problems. But it's a valid scenario. We have used it in few cases, and
Mm-hmm.
FTP or file share also works. One of the things which I used more frequently is publishing Azure file share as a local share on-premise.
Mm-hmm.
So Logic App, it becomes a Azure file share connection, and
Mm,
on-premise, it becomes a local file share.
mm.
So, and that gives a good handshake.
Okay. We certainly decouple our Logic app from our on-premise system with this file share component. So now I have another question about Azure functions. Say Azure function is also another alternate that I can fit into all those scenarios that we discussed now. So when should I choose an between a Logic app and an Azure function?
Yeah, that's an interesting question,
Mm,
and I think it comes to be quite often.
mm-hmm,
And there are multiple parameters which you need to consider. I
mm.
think first important parameter is most of the things which you can do in Azure Logic App, you can do it in Azure Function. Okay, but
Yes.
it's
Mm,
not other way around. So Azure
mm,
Function is much more capable technically than what Logic App is doing. So there are many things which you can do in Azure Function which you cannot achieve in Logic App. Okay,
mm, mm,
so that's on the pure technical side. When it comes to coding or when it comes to deciding,
mm-hmm,
Logic App is more clean implementation and more orchestration based implementation. Okay,
mm-hmm,
so if you have a scenario where you have a HTTP trigger and that is trigger is branching out into 5 different steps, and those steps has some different activities, and
mm,
your Logic App has around 100 actions like this.
mm.
It's difficult to code those 100 actions in Azure function.
True.
Okay,
Mm,
so in scenario, Logic App is definitely a better approach. If
mm,
you have a
mm,
integration with lot of small steps on interface,
mm-hmm,
not complex logic to implement, but many steps to implement.
mm,
Because Azure function will struggle, and you will over the period, if you have those 50 steps
mm,
in Azure function, it will be challenging to manage and change those steps. Where in Logic App, it's quite easy. But
mm, mm,
that is one thing.
mm,
And in the similar scenario, Azure function is good to perform actions which are repeated in nature
mm-hmm,
and which are like calling a third party. You have to
mm-hmm,
do authentication and then call a third party. Like in one of my scenario, I am getting around thousands of records as input.
mm-hmm,
So, but the way Dynamics works is I trigger a Logic app in the morning at
mm-hmm,
9 a.m. It
mm,
calls our Dynamics package to get 1,000 records on a blob storage.
mm-hmm,
Now, the step in that scenario is I have to read through these individual records and
Mm-hmm.
call a third-party API. Okay.
Mm,
Now,
mm,
if I do scenario in Logic App, it will be a huge cost, and it
mhm,
is too many steps. If you're using Logic App pay-as-you-go model, it's a huge cost. In
mm,
Logic App standard, the cost will be less, but you have many steps to execute.
mm,
So
mm,
pattern is in such scenarios, instead of Logic App doing that hard work of reading 1,000 records and
mm.
processing data, I push that repeated activity inside a function. So the activity has 10 steps, but it has to be done 1,000 times. Okay.
This is an awesome example, very clearly defined when should I choose a function. Please go ahead, Tarun. Yeah.
So in this scenarios, functions are much better.
Mm,
And sometimes uh, if you take this scenario only and take it to the
mm,
support,
mm,
okay.
mm,
Now, Logic App is easy to support any day.
mm, mm,
Okay.
mm,
And my support team, I have many D365 developers who are working day in, day out for D365 projects. Now,
okay.
overnight, I cannot change my support team from D365 to Logic App. Okay.
Mm-hmm,
Now,
mm-hmm,
they find it easy to support a Logic App, to do the initial investigation,
mm-hmm,
and then come back to the person with Logic App understanding for the
mm,
final solution. But if they have to go in Azure function, on step one only, they pass that incident back to the support Azure function expert because it's a
mm.
different capability. You can't cross train. So Azure function
Understood.
is good if you have the correct capability.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, Logic apps are better. So,
Awesome.
and
Mm,
starting point is Logic app. I
mm,
think if someone starts new as a project, he might develop Logic apps initially.
mm-hmm,
Over the period, once he is comfortable with Logic apps,
mm,
that's what I'm also doing. Many repeated work are getting transitioned into Azure function, which are reusable.
mm. Exactly. So
So most,
Logic App is good to get started with, but once you gain the technical knowledge, you would find Azure Function would be an appropriate one to do
yeah,
repeated tasks. Mm,
correct. So, and repeated and reusable. So I have I think a complete Azure function library with me,
mm,
which is used across projects.
mm, mm, mm,
Okay, like I give you a very some example, a small example. Logic apps, you can unzip a file which is of, I think,
mm,
maximum 100 MB or 2 MB.
mm-hmm, mm,
Yeah, 2 MB, I believe. Beyond 2 MB, you cannot unzip a file in Logic app. So you need a function for that. And
mm,
similarly,
mm.
Logic app doesn't give you a zip feature. You cannot zip set of data
Okay.
in Logic app. So I have created two functions, one for zip and one for unzip.
Mm,
Okay.
mm, mm,
And those usable functions used left and right across my projects. So that
mm,
Azure function is better.
mm.
For repeated task, a non-function repeated task, and Logic App is managing the overall orchestration.
Correct. For workflow definitions, Logic Apps would be appropriate. For reusable utilities, Azure Function would be the appropriate solution.
Everyone should create a library of reusable functions in their
Mm-hmm.
organization or project, and they can be used across.
Projects.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yes. So can you throw light in on the Logic App costs, Tarun? Because as we were discussing, you just touched upon the cost that we spend on the Logic App. Can you throw a little more details about what is that I need to be aware of to understand the costing of Logic App?
Yeah. So, in fact, let me explain it with an example because
Mm.
logic apps are costly. Okay, in comparison to
Yes.
function, it looks very small cost, but
Mm.
I have a scenario where actually I have to remove logic app and
Mm-hmm.
move it to function app. So what
Mm-hmm.
was is there is a retail company who
Okay.
is sending approx 10,000 parcels in a day.
Okay.
Okay,
Mm.
and what they have is for each of those 10,000 parcels,
Mm.
they have because you have to book your parcel with your courier company. Okay,
Mm-hmm. Mm.
they have instead of tie up with multiple courier companies, there is a third party API where
Okay.
they have those contracts in place. But
Mm.
at the end of the day, for each parcel to be booked, there is a set of five calls happening, five API calls to this.
Mm.
Okay,
Mm.
so
Mm. Mm.
and on a typical day, I have a 10,000 parcels.
Mm.
It it becomes 50,000 calls,
Oh,
and
yes. Mm.
each 50,000 calls, if you have 10 steps, it
Mm.
becomes in a logic app. If you have 10 actions, then
Mm.
it's 5 lakh or 500,000.
Yes. Mm.
Okay,
Mm.
and if you multiply this 500,000 with 30 days, it becomes a big number. Okay,
Yes, really. Yeah.
just into
Mm.
the costing on Azure calculator, you will get a huge cost.
Yeah. Mm.
In that scenario, what we have done is we have actually moved that complete functionality into an Azure function.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I've seen is logic apps are good if your
Mm.
frequency is less.
Mm-hmm.
If your frequency is going high, then
Mm-hmm.
definitely logic app pay as you go is not a cheap solution. It's a very costly solution. So
Mm-hmm.
if your logic apps is getting executed 1,000 times in a day, so you have to figure out what cost you are having, and then you have
Mm-hmm.
to look at cost models like instead of logic app pay as you go, you can go for logic app standard.
Mm.
uh, Next step and the new thing these days. And
Yes.
so, but costing is important. One has to do a costing model. I used
Mm.
to do all my projects because whenever we bid or we discuss the solution, we
Mm-hmm.
have to explain customer on costing two things. One is cost of development of an interface, and one is the monthly cost for that interface.
Mm-hmm.
Azure is all about running cost.
Exactly. So, an Azure function on app service plan against this logic app and consumption would be an better alternate is what you're recommending, isn't it, Tarun?
Yeah,
Yes, and
yeah,
for a better predictable cost. And
yeah.
as you mentioned, Logic App Standard can come in as a solution for an predictable cost scenario. But is there anything that I need to reconsider before I decide to transform my consumption Logic apps to the standard?
Yeah, first of all, there should be some reason.
Mm,
Okay.
mm, mm,
It's a very common question which I'm getting these days.
mm,
Even if I rephrase the question that should I
mm.
use Logic Standard or Logic App uh, pay as you,
Consumption.
yeah,
Yeah.
consumption,
Mm, mm,
or and what should be the reason between the two? Okay.
mm, mm,
And typically, if someone coming from reading the initial bits about it, they will talk about cost.
mm,
But typically says that Logic App Standard reason for using Logic App Standard is more on security.
mm-hmm,
Okay, it's not its cost is there, but I would select Logic App Standard because
mm,
it is an app service plan and you can put a VNet, so you
mm,
get a stable cost and you get a security
mm,
both.
mm,
So security feature, I believe, should be the main deciding criteria.
mm,
And second point should be the cost. Cost
mm,
definitely Logic App Standard are cheaper
mm-hmm.
than more predictable than Logic App this concept.
Consumption.
But
Mm,
you on the flip side,
mm-hmm.
like Logic App Standard can support a sizable workload. Is as
Okay.
good as getting a bespoke virtual machine with a defined capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose if you are going on a Black Friday for 2 days,
Mm,
no, you might your Logic App Standard might not be able to support that load. You have to do some changes or increase your capacity, plan around
mm-hmm.
it.
Mm,
But Logic App consumption, you are not bothered whether it is a Black Friday or
mm.
it will scale out automatically.
Seamlessly scales. Yeah. Mm,
Logic App Standard is good from security, from costing, but you have to put additional effort if you need more resources to be built around it for
mm,
additional processing.
mm. Understand. So we
Everyone
need
has,
to take a call. Yeah.
yeah, everyone has, everything has some pros and cons.
Mm,
And I think there should be some. So what I typically do in my projects,
mm,
when we take a particular decision, I write it down why I took that decision. What are the
mm,
5 reasons? Because
mm,
what is view I am having at that point in time? Because
mm,
the project keeps on changing, scope change, everything. And
mm,
what are the pros and cons?
mm,
So later 3 months, 6 months down the line, once I revisit that solution or revisit that design,
mm,
I pick up again those points and then redefine things. And then it becomes easy to explain also,
mm,
uh,
mm, mm.
because you keep on working on multiple solutions and projects. So after 6 months,
Correct.
you remember why you have taken that decision 6 months early. So it becomes easy to defend your decision, that why you are changing now or why you are proposing a new thing now. But at the end of the day, Logic App Standard is pretty exciting space. I
Mm,
myself using it in most of my new projects.
mm-hmm,
And one interesting thing which I have done recently with Logic App Standard is I have done a complete DevOps cycle with Logic App Standard.
mm-hmm,
So right from the single click, I can deploy my complete Logic App Standard from Azure DevOps pipelines, YAML pipelines to uh, Azure portal. So we
mm,
are almost zero touch deployment. I will not say 100% because
mm,
some steps are
mm,
manual, but
mm-hmm, mm.
95% automated deployments using Azure DevOps YAML pipelines.
Awesome. Yeah, so this last few minutes, I didn't realize how well spent it is. So it's a lot of information, real production, hands-on experiences. Thanks for enlightening us with your experience, Tarun. Um, and is there anything that you would like to give away, take away as a tip to the listeners of today's show?
Yeah, I think thanks for inviting me. I
Mm-hmm.
would say as a concluding remark that
Mm,
Logic App, Azure Function, Azure uh, Data Factory, and you could have few other things. These are all part of Azure Integration Service.
mm,
They have their specific use case,
mm,
okay, and it might be confusing initially, but
mm-hmm.
if you read about it and understand them properly, there are particular scenarios which where you can use a particular service. Like I've explained about Azure Function, if volumes are high, you use
Mm,
Azure Function and Logic App.
mm,
Similarly, if volumes are even high, you can use Azure Data Factory, which we have not touched here.
mm-hmm.
But one has to remember that Microsoft has provided all these services with a specific use case in mind.
Mhm,
So just concentrate on which use case is better for which
mhm.
service. Otherwise,
Yeah.
if you abuse a use case, you will say the service is bad, which
Mhm,
is the case for any of the services. All services are good. It's at times, if you fit in a bad use case, it becomes bad.
mm. True. So we need to define our business objective and understand the Microsoft Azure offered services, fit them into the business needs.
Correct.
Mm,
It's very
yes.
critical. And these days, it's becoming extremely challenging also. With
Mhm.
new people coming in, day two, they know how Logic App works. They want to do everything in Logic App. It becomes challenging.
Okay. That's a very important tip, Tarun. Yeah, because it looks attractive and easy to get started with. It doesn't mean that Logic App is a solution for all our business needs. There
Yeah.
are good amount of services which we need to understand and appreciate them by using them in the appropriate scenarios.
That's true.
That's an excellent discussion that we had today. A lot of useful information and examples. And one personal takeaway for me is to any decision that I make, as you said, I'm going to write down and then keep why did I make this decision so that we can come back and then revalidate or revisit whenever it is required.
Okay.
Awesome, Tarun. Awesome having you in our show. Thank you so much. Wish to connect with you more often in upcoming scenarios.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Have a nice
Thank
day.
you. Yeah.
Cove.co.